The constable who arrived first was young, barely 30, with the determined expression of a man eager to prove his competence in a situation that demanded far more than youthful enthusiasm could provide. His name was Constable Davies, and he moved through the gathered guests with a notebook, recording their names and initial observations with the methodical precision of someone following a training manual rather than responding to the organic chaos of genuine tragedy. Inspector Blackwood, the senior investigator from the county town, did not arrive until nearly 4:30, by which time the afternoon had taken on the peculiar quality of suspended time that accompanies sudden death in small communities. He was a man of perhaps 60, with silver hair and the weary demeanor of someone who had seen too much of human nature's darker impulses to maintain much faith in either justice or virtue. His first action was to clear the immediate area around the gazebo, establishing it as a crime scene with the kind of authority that brooked no argument, then to begin interviewing the guests more thoroughly than young Davies had managed. Miss Marple observed all of this from her chair, where she had returned after giving her own statement, her knitting needles continuing their rhythmic work despite the gravity of the circumstances. She had answered the constable's questions with the kind of careful vagueness that served her well in such situations, noting only that she had been seated near the house when she heard the scream, that she had followed others toward the orchard path, and that she had observed nothing of particular significance before the body was discovered. The inspector had not thought to question her further, which was precisely as it should be. What was far more interesting than the official investigation, Miss Marple reflected, was the behavior of the living guests as the afternoon wore on and the initial shock began to crystallize into something more complex. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, despite her pale complexion and trembling hands, seemed oddly composed, almost, if one was cynical enough to suggest such a thing, relieved. She had inherited the estate from her husband 20 years previously, and Thomas, as her nephew and de facto manager, had been a constant fixture in her life, present at nearly every family occasion and decision. Yet there was no visible affection in her bearing, no sense of genuine grief. Instead, there was something that resembled, to Miss Marple's practiced eye, the relief of someone who has been released from an obligation they had long found burdensome. The banker, Mr. Denby, displayed quite different symptoms. His anxiety was palpable, manifesting in the way his fingers repeatedly checked his waistcoat pocket, the way his eyes darted about the garden as though searching for some avenue of escape. Frances, his daughter, had been sedated by Dr. Ashton and removed to a quiet room in the house, but before her departure, Miss Marple had noticed something curious in her expression, a flicker of something that was not quite fear and certainly not grief, but rather a complex calculation, as though the young woman were already mentally adjusting to new circumstances. Miss Constance Webb, ever the observer of others' misfortunes, had positioned herself strategically among the guests, asking pointed questions and gathering information with the efficiency of someone who had made a career of village gossip. Her face bore an expression of keen interest that bordered on unseemly enjoyment, the expression of someone for whom scandal and tragedy provided far more entertainment than any of the standard village entertainments could possibly offer. The schoolmaster, Mr. Edmund Briggs, had excused himself shortly after giving his statement, mentioning that he needed to return to his lodgings, and the inspector had not thought to detain him. Miss Marple had observed his departure with particular interest, noting the way his jaw had tightened when he first saw the body, the way his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. There was something in his reaction that suggested personal rather than merely social distress. The vicar's wife, Margaret, had been occupied primarily with organizing refreshments for the guests and the police, a task that seemed to comfort her far more than the presence of sudden death should have done. She moved about the garden with the determined efficiency of someone channeling shock into productive activity, and Miss Marple recognized in this behavior the coping mechanism of a woman who had learned, through years of parish life, to compartmentalize her emotional responses. By the time Inspector Blackwood announced that he would need to conduct more thorough interviews the following day at the police station, the afternoon had faded into early evening, and the garden party that had begun with such civilized promise had taken on the atmosphere of a funeral gathering. The guests dispersed reluctantly, none wishing to be the first to leave, yet all desperate to escape the terrible weight of what had occurred in their peaceful village. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, exchanging only the briefest of pleasantries with Mrs. Hartwell, who had followed her to the gate with the automaticity of a hostess, honoring her social obligations even in circumstances that rendered such formalities almost absurd. As she walked back toward her cottage on the edge of the village, Miss Marple's mind was already constructing possibilities, examining the small details she had observed with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that the smallest inconsistencies often revealed the largest truths. The brass key beside Thomas's body, she reflected, was perhaps significant. Thomas would have had keys aplenty as the estate manager. Why would this particular key merit special attention? And why, she wondered, had Mr. Denby's pocket-checking been so frequent and so anxious? These were questions that would bear consideration, particularly once the police had completed their preliminary investigations and the village had begun to settle into the peculiar rhythm of a community learning to live alongside murder. The following morning dawned with a kind of crystalline clarity that seemed almost indecent in its beauty, as though nature had failed to recognize that tragedy had visited Thornfield during the previous afternoon. Miss Marple had slept poorly, her mind occupied with the slow, methodical cataloguing of inconsistencies and curious details that had presented themselves during the garden party incident. She had risen at her customary hour of 6 o'clock, prepared her tea with deliberate care, and settled into a comfortable armchair by the window with the village's primary source of gossip. Mrs. Rutherford, who ran the post office and served as the unofficial clearinghouse for all information, rumor, and speculation that circulated through Thornfield's tightly knit community. Mrs. Rutherford arrived promptly at 7:30, ostensibly to deliver the morning mail, but in reality to extract every possible detail about the previous day's events from someone whom she correctly identified as an eyewitness of significant standing. Miss Marple received her with the graciousness that came naturally to her, offering tea and biscuits while allowing her visitor to speak with the expansive freedom of someone sharing information rather than extracting it. According to Mrs. Rutherford, whose sources were invariably reliable despite their occasionally sensational presentation, Thomas Hartwell had been in considerable financial difficulty. This revelation emerged not through direct statement, but through the careful piecing together of overheard conversations, observed transactions, and the general knowledge that accumulated in a village where financial circumstances were as transparent as the morning light. Thomas had apparently made some unfortunate investments some months previously, money that did not belong to him but rather to his aunt, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. The exact amount remained unclear, but the village consensus suggested it was substantial, perhaps as much as £800, a sum that represented a considerable portion of a working man's lifetime earnings. Furthermore, Mrs. Rutherford continued with the relish of someone delivering particularly choice gossip. There had been tension between Thomas and Mr. Denby over a matter of business. The exact nature of this dispute was unclear, but it apparently involved some land adjacent to the banker's property that Thomas had been attempting to acquire through his aunt's influence and resources. Mr. Denby, it seemed, had been equally interested in the same parcel and had made his own offer to Mrs. Hartwell, an offer that Thomas had viewed with considerable alarm. This information, when combined with what Miss Marple had observed during the previous afternoon regarding Mr. Denby's anxious behavior, suggested a possible motive for Thomas's demise, though whether the motive belonged to the banker himself or to someone else entirely remained a question that required considerably more investigation. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Rutherford for her thoughtfulness in keeping her informed and gently encouraged her visitor toward departure by the simple expedient of mentioning that she had promised to call on the vicar's wife that morning to inquire after Margaret's health. Once she was alone again, Miss Marple allowed herself the small pleasure of sitting with her thoughts, her needlework abandoned on the arm of her chair as she contemplated the emerging picture of Thomas Hartwell's circumstances. By mid-morning, she had arranged to encounter Mr. Edmund Briggs quite by accident near the village post office, though accident had played remarkably little role in the arrangement. The schoolmaster appeared diminished somehow in the morning light, as though the shock of the previous day's events had physically reduced him. He accepted her invitation to walk toward the park with what appeared to be genuine relief at the prospect of conversation with someone who was not actively gossiping or speculating about the circumstances of Thomas's death. As they walked, Miss Marple remarked quite casually upon the pleasant weather and the excellent quality of the roses in the cottage gardens they passed, allowing Mr. Briggs to establish his own conversational pace. After several minutes of these innocuous observations, she mentioned, in the manner of someone making a perfectly ordinary connection, that Thomas Hartwell had been one of his pupils some years previously. Mr. Briggs's response was immediate and somewhat sharp, an affirmative that suggested the memory was not a pleasant one. Miss Marple pressed gently, noting that she had observed a certain tension in his expression when the body had been discovered, and she wondered, in her gentle way, whether there might be some history of difficulty between the schoolmaster and the deceased. Mr. Briggs was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back as they walked, his eyes focused on the middle distance rather than on his companion. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and careful, the voice of a man choosing his words with deliberate precision. Thomas Hartwell, he explained, had been a student of considerable promise and equally considerable moral flexibility. There had been an incident, some 12 years previously, involving funds that had been collected for a school fundraising effort. Thomas had been assisting with the bookkeeping, and certain sums had gone missing. The matter had been investigated quietly, and though nothing had been definitively proven, it had been generally understood that Thomas bore responsibility for the disappearance. The incident had been handled discreetly by the school governors, but it had effectively ended any possibility of Thomas pursuing further education or entering any profession that required a position of trust. Miss Marple listened to this account with her customary attentiveness, asking no questions and making no judgments, allowing Mr. Briggs to reveal what he clearly felt compelled to share. As they parted company at the edge of the park, she thanked him quietly for his candor and observed that it seemed Thomas Hartwell had carried something of a pattern throughout his life, a tendency toward misappropriating funds that did not belong to him. Mr. Briggs's expression suggested that he recognized this observation with the weight of uncomfortable confirmation. The police station in Thornfield occupied a modest Victorian building adjacent to the town hall, its institutional brown paint and narrow windows giving it the appearance of a structure designed to convey authority rather than warmth. Miss Marple had been invited to provide a more formal statement on the morning of the second day following Thomas Hartwell's death, an invitation that she had accepted with her customary graciousness, despite the considerable inconvenience it represented to her morning routine. Inspector Blackwood received her in his temporary office, the constable's usual quarters commandeered for the investigation, with the kind of courtesy that suggested he recognized in her a person of some standing within the village hierarchy. He was considerably more thorough in his questioning than young Constable Davies had been, and Miss Marple found herself providing more detailed observations than she had initially intended, all the while maintaining the careful demeanor of an elderly woman attempting to be helpful while admitting the limitations of her perception and memory. She described the scene at the gazebo with precision, noting the position of the body, the scattered debris, and the curious brass key that had captured her attention so distinctly. Inspector Blackwood had leaned forward at this last detail, his manner sharpening with interest as he consulted his notes and confirmed that the key had indeed been found and catalogued, though its purpose and significance remained unclear. The preliminary examination of the gazebo structure itself had revealed that the collapse was not entirely accidental. Several of the support beams had been deliberately weakened, cut partially through with what appeared to be a saw, suggesting that the structure's failure was contingent upon someone placing significant weight upon the damaged section. The inspector had watched her carefully as she absorbed this information, seemingly interested in whether she would react with surprise or recognition to the revelation that they were dealing with premeditated murder rather than a tragic accident. Over the course of the following day, as Miss Marple moved through the village attending to her various social obligations, the pieces of the puzzle began to arrange themselves with increasing clarity. She learned from the vicar's wife, Margaret, during a call ostensibly concerned with the state of the church flower arrangements, that Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell had been planning to significantly revise her will, removing Thomas as the primary heir and substituting instead her nephew's younger brother, James, who currently lived in Scotland and had maintained considerably less contact with his aunt than Thomas had done. The reason for this revision, according to Margaret's careful understanding, involved the discovery of Thomas's financial misdeeds and Mrs. Hartwell's fury at having been deceived by a family member she had trusted implicitly. The alteration to the will had apparently been discussed with the village solicitor only 2 days before Thomas's death, suggesting that Mrs. Hartwell had acted with remarkable speed and determination once her nephew's perfidy had been revealed to her. Miss Marple filed this information away with the same meticulous care she applied to her knitting, understanding that motivation and opportunity were the twin foundations upon which murder investigations ultimately rested. The matter of the brass key, however, continued to intrigue her in a way that suggested it represented something more significant than its seemingly mundane appearance might indicate. She had observed that Mr. Denby, when questioned about it during his own interview with Inspector Blackwood, had seemed to understand its significance immediately, though he had claimed ignorance as to its purpose or provenance. There was something in the banker's response, a carefully controlled reaction that suggested he recognized the key but had deemed it expedient to lie about this recognition, that warranted further investigation. It was Miss Constance Webb, that relentless collector of village secrets, who provided the crucial piece of information that illuminated the key's significance. Miss Marple had encountered her at the market, where Constance was purchasing vegetables with the meticulous attention to price and quality that characterized her approach to all financial transactions. In the course of their conversation, which had begun innocuously enough with observations about the quality of the season's produce, Constance had mentioned, with the satisfied air of someone revealing a particularly delicious piece of gossip, that she had observed Mr. Denby and Thomas Hartwell in what appeared to be an animated disagreement near the Brennan house, the property that had been closed for nearly 2 years and that stood on the far edge of the village. According to Constance, who had been taking one of her characteristic walks through the less populated areas of the village, the 2 men had emerged from the house at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon some 10 days previously, and Thomas had appeared to be in considerable distress, while Mr. Denby had seemed grimly satisfied with whatever transaction or confrontation had occurred within those walls. Furthermore, Constance added with barely suppressed relish, she had observed Thomas attempting to force open one of the windows of the Brennan house on the following day, apparently without success, and he had appeared to be searching for something. This information, when combined with the presence of the brass key at the scene of Thomas's death and Miss Marple's growing understanding of the financial entanglements that characterized village life, suggested that the Brennan house itself was relevant to the investigation in ways that the police had not yet comprehended. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her comfortable armchair with her knitting, she made a quiet decision. She would need to visit the Brennan house herself and examine its contents with her own observant eyes. The police, for all their official authority and procedural expertise, were bound by the constraints of their position, unable to act on mere suspicion or to investigate properties without the most explicit justification. Miss Marple, however, operated under no such constraints, and she possessed something that Inspector Blackwood did not: a lifetime of experience in understanding how the human heart motivated human action. The Brennan house stood at the eastern terminus of the village like a silent sentinel guarding secrets that the living community seemed collectively determined to ignore. Miss Marple approached it on the morning of the third day following Thomas Hartwell's death, having manufactured a perfectly reasonable pretext for her solitary walk by mentioning to her daily help that she intended to gather certain wild flowers that grew only in the uncultivated areas beyond the village proper. The house itself was a substantial Victorian structure, built of red brick and decorated with the kind of architectural flourishes that suggested its original owner had possessed both considerable wealth and questionable taste. The grounds had fallen into a state of romantic neglect, with overgrown gardens and windows obscured by the accumulated grime of 2 years' abandonment. Miss Marple circled the property with the unhurried pace of someone simply taking a constitutional walk, noting details with the practiced eye of an observer who had learned, through decades of village life, to distinguish between natural decay and deliberate concealment. The front door bore evidence of recent tampering. Scratches around the lock mechanism suggested that someone had attempted to force entry within the recent past, most likely Thomas Hartwell in his desperate search for whatever the brass key was meant to unlock. A side entrance, however, proved more accommodating to her purposes. The back door's lock had corroded through years of neglect and damp English weather, and a firm but careful application of pressure allowed it to yield to her determined efforts. Miss Marple slipped inside with the furtive movements of someone considerably less accustomed to such activities than her calm demeanor might suggest, her heart beating with the excitement of transgression tempered by the certainty that necessity justified her trespass. The interior of the Brennan house was a study in abandoned domesticity. Furniture remained where it had been left, now covered in dust and the patient work of spiders who had made excellent use of the uninterrupted years. The air was thick and stale, carrying the odor of damp and neglect that accumulates in unoccupied spaces. Yet as Miss Marple made her way through the ground floor, she began to observe signs of recent activity that suggested the house had not been entirely undisturbed despite its locked doors and sealed appearance. The dust patterns on certain surfaces indicated that objects had been moved or handled within the past weeks, and the study bore particular evidence of investigation. Papers scattered across the desk as though someone had conducted a thorough but hasty search. It was in the study that Miss Marple discovered the locked cabinet, a substantial wooden piece with brass fittings that matched the description one might apply to the key that had been found beside Thomas's body. The cabinet itself bore fresh scratches around its lock, evidence of the violence with which Thomas had attempted to force it open. Miss Marple produced the brass key from her handbag, an item she had persuaded Inspector Blackwood to allow her to examine under the pretense of assisting the investigation through her superior knowledge of local geography and customs, and fitted it carefully into the lock. The mechanism turned with surprising smoothness, suggesting that the cabinet had been opened recently and maintained in working order despite the general decay surrounding it. The contents of the cabinet proved considerably more illuminating than their mundane appearance might suggest. Within lay a collection of documents and correspondence that painted a picture of financial entanglement and deliberate deception of considerable sophistication. The papers revealed that the Brennan house had been purchased by Mr. Harold Denby approximately 18 months previously, using funds that appeared to have come from an intermediary rather than from the banker's own legitimate accounts. Furthermore, the documents contained correspondence between Mr. Denby and a solicitor in London, suggesting that the property was being held as security for a substantial debt. A debt that had apparently been incurred through questionable investment schemes and business ventures that had collapsed spectacularly. Thomas Hartwell's name appeared repeatedly throughout this correspondence, associated with payments and transfers that suggested he had been involved in facilitating these financial arrangements. Most significantly, there existed a letter dated approximately 6 weeks previously in which Thomas had informed Mr. Denby that he intended to withdraw his cooperation and involvement in the scheme, threatening to reveal the entire arrangement to his aunt, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, unless Mr. Denby agreed to make substantial restitution payments. This letter, combined with the evidence of Thomas's recent attempts to force open the cabinet, suggested a narrative in which Thomas had been conducting his own investigation into the nature of his aunt's involvement in whatever dubious financial activities Mr. Denby had undertaken. Miss Marple photographed the most relevant documents in her mind with the precision of someone who had developed considerable skill in observing and retaining complex information, then carefully replaced them in their original positions. She secured the cabinet once more and made her way back through the house to the side entrance through which she had entered, her mind already beginning to construct the architecture of motive and opportunity that would explain Thomas Hartwell's death. As she stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, she found herself confronted with an unexpected sight that caused her to pause momentarily in genuine surprise. Inspector Blackwood stood near the overgrown garden, apparently conducting his own investigation of the property with a warrant that presumably granted him legitimate authority for his presence. The inspector's expression suggested that he had not anticipated encountering Miss Marple in this location, and a moment of mutual recognition passed between them, an understanding that each possessed information that the other did not yet fully comprehend. Inspector Blackwood approached her with an expression that combined exasperation and a certain reluctant respect, and Miss Marple recognized in his bearing the presence of a professional investigator who had begun to suspect that the solution to his case might lie not in the methodical accumulation of forensic evidence, but in the subtle understanding of human psychology possessed by an elderly woman whose apparent harmlessness concealed a formidable intellect devoted to the understanding of human nature's darker impulses. Inspector Blackwood's countenance suggested a man confronting an unexpected complication to what he had believed to be a relatively straightforward investigation, and Miss Marple recognized in his expression the peculiar mixture of professional irritation and grudging acknowledgement that characterized his relationship with her presence in his case. He gestured toward the house with a deliberate civility that could not quite mask his underlying skepticism regarding her explanation for being present at a location that was, strictly speaking, outside the boundaries of her customary walking routes. Miss Marple, however, had anticipated precisely this moment and had prepared her response with the careful attention to plausibility that came naturally to someone who had spent decades navigating the social conventions of village life. She explained with perfect truthfulness that she had been taking a constitutional walk and had observed signs of recent disturbance around the property, which had prompted her curiosity regarding whether the police investigation had extended to this location. Her explanation was sufficiently vague to contain no actual falsehood, while remaining strategically incomplete regarding the precise nature of her activities within the house. Inspector Blackwood studied her with the intensity of a man attempting to determine whether she was, in fact, being entirely forthcoming, or whether she was engaging in one of her characteristic evasions. After a moment of silence that seemed to extend beyond the bounds of ordinary social comfort, he invited her to accompany him inside the Brennan house, suggesting that her observations regarding the property might prove valuable to his investigation, a suggestion that Miss Marple accepted with what appeared to be genuine surprise at his invitation. Together they examined the study and, most significantly, the cabinet whose contents Miss Marple had so recently reviewed. Inspector Blackwood produced the brass key from his own pocket, indicating that he had secured a duplicate or had otherwise gained access to the original, and opened the cabinet with the methodical care of someone conducting an official investigation. His expression as he reviewed the documents suggested that this was his first encounter with the materials, and Miss Marple observed with interest the progression of his reactions as understanding began to crystallize in his professional mind. The letters from Thomas to Mr. Denby, the financial records, the evidence of the questionable transactions, all of these elements began to arrange themselves into a pattern that suggested a motive considerably more complex than simple financial gain or personal animosity. Inspector Blackwood turned to Miss Marple with the air of a man who had recognized that her presence at this location, however irregular, might reflect knowledge that she had deliberately refrained from articulating in her official statement. He asked, with the careful directness of a trained investigator, whether she had observed anything in the materials that seemed to her particularly significant. Miss Marple considered her response with the deliberation that characterized her approach to all matters of consequence, recognizing that this was a moment at which her input could substantially influence the direction of the official investigation. She began, therefore, to articulate certain observations that she had made regarding the timeline suggested by the documents, noting that the letter in which Thomas had threatened to expose the financial scheme appeared to have been written approximately 6 weeks previously, yet the property itself bore evidence of having been recently searched or investigated. This suggested, she observed quietly, that the discovery of Thomas's intention to withdraw his cooperation must have prompted considerable urgency on the part of whoever had an interest in maintaining the secrecy of the financial arrangements. Furthermore, she noted, the nature of the scheme itself suggested not merely the involvement of Mr. Denby, but potentially other parties whose interests were similarly threatened by exposure. Inspector Blackwood listened to these observations with the attentive silence of someone who recognized that he was receiving information that would substantially alter his understanding of the case. He then revealed, with the calculated candor of an investigator who had determined that disclosure might elicit further cooperation, that his examination of Mr. Denby's financial records had revealed involvement not merely in suspicious investments, but in what appeared to be systematic embezzlement from the bank itself. A sum that totaled nearly £3,000, an amount of such magnitude that discovery would inevitably result in criminal prosecution and imprisonment. The murder of Thomas Hartwell, therefore, took on new dimensions. It was no longer simply a matter of personal animosity or the settling of financial disputes, but rather the elimination of a witness to criminal enterprise of considerable proportions. Miss Marple ventured with the careful hesitation of someone advancing a theory rather than stating established fact, that perhaps the investigation should examine not merely Mr. Denby's actions, but also the question of who might have been sufficiently aware of his circumstances to take action to prevent exposure. Inspector Blackwood's expression suggested that this line of reasoning had not previously occurred to him, and he requested, with what appeared to be genuine deference, that Miss Marple expand upon this observation. She explained that in her experience, criminal enterprises of this magnitude rarely operated in isolation. There were invariably others who possessed knowledge of the activities, whether as active participants or as individuals who had been entrusted with information through necessity or circumstance. The question was not merely who had the motive to silence Thomas Hartwell, but rather who possessed both the knowledge of his intentions and the proximity to him that would enable the careful planning and execution of his murder. As they stood in the dusty study of the abandoned house, with the afternoon light filtering through the grimy windows, Inspector Blackwood appeared to undergo a subtle transformation in his understanding of the case. He closed the cabinet door with deliberate care and turned to Miss Marple with an expression that combined frustration with the grudging recognition that his investigation had been incomplete in its scope, and that the true resolution of Thomas Hartwell's death might lie not in the examination of obvious suspects, but in the careful reconstruction of relationships and knowledge that extended beyond the boundaries of what the official investigation had thus far considered. The afternoon had begun to fade into the golden light of approaching evening. When Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind engaged in the complex work of reassessing the relationships and interactions that had characterized village life in Thornfield over the preceding weeks and months. She found herself contemplating, with particular intensity, the curious behavior of various individuals during and after the garden party at which Thomas's body had been discovered. Inspector Blackwood, she reflected, would be occupied with the methodical examination of financial records and the reconstruction of Mr. Denby's criminal activities. but the solution to the murder itself required an understanding of something far more subtle and psychologically nuanced than simple forensic investigation could provide. The question of who had possessed knowledge of Thomas's intentions to expose the financial scheme remained paramount, and Miss Marple found herself returning repeatedly to her observations regarding the reactions of the guests at Mrs. Hartwell's garden party. It was on the following morning, as she sat taking her breakfast in the gentle light of her front room, that she received an unexpected visitor in the form of Frances Denby, the banker's daughter who had been the unfortunate discoverer of Thomas's body. Frances appeared considerably more composed than she had been during the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, though her eyes bore the slight redness of recent tears, and her hands trembled with a tension that suggested emotional turmoil inadequately concealed beneath a composed exterior. Miss Marple received her with the warmth that she extended to all who sought her counsel, offering tea and biscuits while allowing Frances to establish her own pace of conversation. It was evident that the younger woman had come with a specific purpose, though she appeared uncertain how to articulate it, beginning several sentences only to abandon them mid-thought as though the words she required kept eluding her capacity to express them. Eventually, however, with the encouragement of Miss Marple's patient silence, Frances began to speak of her relationship with Thomas Hartwell, revealing that there had existed between them a romantic attachment of several months' duration, a relationship that she had kept deliberately hidden from her father due to her understanding of Mr. Denby's disapproval of Thomas as a suitor. This revelation illuminated, with sudden clarity, a dimension of the situation that had previously remained obscure. Thomas had not been merely attempting to threaten her father with exposure of financial crimes, motivated by abstract moral principles, but rather by the desire to secure his own position and future prospects through the restoration of his reputation and circumstances. Frances explained with the halting delivery of someone disclosing information that carried considerable emotional weight that Thomas had confided in her regarding his intention to confront her father and demand that the financial scheme be terminated and proper restitution made. He had believed that this action would vindicate his character and demonstrate to her father that he was a man of honor rather than a criminal associate. What had troubled Frances most profoundly, and what had prompted her to seek Miss Marple's counsel, was the question of whether her father might have been sufficiently alarmed by Thomas's threats to take action to prevent exposure. She had not, she explained with evident distress, directly accused her father of involvement in Thomas's death, but the possibility had occurred to her with a force that she could not entirely dismiss. Miss Marple listened to this confession with the attentive compassion that characterized her approach to such disclosures, recognizing in Frances's anxiety the genuine affection that she bore for both her father and the deceased young man. However, as Miss Marple considered the timeline and the evidence that Inspector Blackwood had revealed, she found herself reaching a conclusion that diverged from Frances's apparent assumption regarding her father's guilt. The positioning of the body beneath the collapsed gazebo, combined with the evidence of deliberate structural weakening, suggested careful planning and considerable physical effort. Effort that would have been challenging for a man of Mr. Denby's age and physical condition to undertake alone, particularly with sufficient stealth to avoid detection. Furthermore, there existed in Miss Marple's mind a peculiar inconsistency regarding Mr. Denby's behavior that suggested his anxiety stemmed not from knowledge of his involvement in the murder, but rather from fear of exposure regarding the financial crimes themselves. It was at this point in her conversation with Frances that Miss Marple ventured a delicate inquiry regarding the young woman's own whereabouts and activities during the period immediately preceding the discovery of Thomas's body. Frances appeared momentarily startled by this line of questioning, her composure slipping slightly to reveal the anxiety that lay beneath her controlled exterior. She explained that she had left the garden party ostensibly to seek solitude, but in reality to meet Thomas briefly near the orchard path, where they had arranged a secret meeting to discuss his intended confrontation with her father. Their conversation had lasted only a few minutes, during which Thomas had expressed his determination to proceed with his plan despite the risks it entailed. They had parted company with the understanding that he would speak with her father during the following week, once he had gathered sufficient documentation to substantiate his accusations. This revelation, combined with Miss Marple's understanding of the physical evidence and the timeline of events, suggested a scenario considerably more complex than simple murder motivated by fear of financial exposure. As Frances departed Miss Marple's cottage, the elderly woman found herself occupied with the realization that the solution to Thomas Hartwell's death might involve not merely Mr. Denby's criminal activities, but rather the intersection of multiple motives and the subtle manipulation of circumstances by someone whose involvement in the murder had thus far escaped serious consideration. The answer, she reflected, often lay not in what was obvious, but in what remained carefully concealed beneath the surface of village propriety and social convention. The revelation provided by Frances Denby had catalyzed a shift in Miss Marple's understanding of the murder, and she found herself compelled to reconsider the evidence with fresh perspective and renewed attention to those details that had initially seemed peripheral or insignificant. She began a careful review of her observations regarding the various individuals present at the garden party, examining with particular scrutiny the reactions and behaviors that had seemed unremarkable in the immediate aftermath of the discovery, but which now took on considerably more suggestive dimensions when reconsidered in light of new information. It was the behavior of Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell that commanded her attention most insistently, for there existed in the widow's response to her nephew's death an element of composure that transcended mere emotional restraint and suggested instead a calculated management of her apparent reactions. Furthermore, Miss Marple recalled with crystalline precision the conversation she had conducted with the vicar's wife regarding Mrs. Hartwell's intention to alter her will, removing Thomas as the primary heir. The timing of this intention was crucial. Mrs. Hartwell had discovered Thomas's financial misdeeds and had acted with remarkable speed to revise her estate planning, yet she had not initially taken legal action against her nephew or removed him from his position managing her affairs. This apparent contradiction suggested a woman occupied with considerations more subtle and complex than simple vindication or the preservation of her estate. Miss Marple resolved to undertake a more direct investigation of Mrs. Hartwell's circumstances and intentions, and she engineered an encounter with the widow at the village market on the following afternoon. The meeting appeared entirely accidental, though Miss Marple had in fact ascertained through careful inquiry that Mrs. Hartwell maintained a precise routine regarding her weekly shopping, and she had positioned herself accordingly to facilitate their collision. They exchanged the customary pleasantries and walked together toward Mrs. Hartwell's motor car, with the ease of two women who had lived in proximity for decades and understood the rhythms of village social interaction. Miss Marple ventured with the apparent casualness of genuine concern that she imagined Mrs. Hartwell must be experiencing considerable distress not merely from the tragedy of Thomas's death, but also from the complications regarding his financial misdeeds and the necessary alterations to her estate. Mrs. Hartwell's response was notably guarded, her expression suggesting that she recognized in Miss Marple's inquiry a probing for information rather than a simple expression of sympathy. However, the widow appeared willing to acknowledge certain facts, explaining with a restraint that bordered on coldness that she had been indeed forced to confront uncomfortable truths regarding her nephew's character and had taken steps to protect her remaining assets from further depredation. She mentioned, with particular emphasis, that she had intended to remove Thomas from his position of trust and had planned to discuss the matter with him on the day following his death. This admission, while seemingly straightforward, contained within it a peculiar inconsistency that Miss Marple's trained observational abilities immediately recognized. Mrs. Hartwell had claimed to have discovered Thomas's financial crimes only recently. Yet the evidence suggested that knowledge of his activities would have required considerable investigation and accumulation of detail. Furthermore, The speed with which she had acted to revise her will indicated that she had not merely suspected misconduct, but had possessed what she believed to be definitive proof. Miss Marple asked, therefore, with what appeared to be innocent curiosity, how precisely Mrs. Hartwell had come to discover the nature and extent of her nephew's financial activities. The widow's hesitation before responding was barely perceptible, yet it suggested an awareness that her explanation required careful construction. She revealed finally that she had been visited by Mr. Denby, who had informed her of Thomas's involvement in his financial schemes and had provided her with documentation sufficient to convince her of the truth of his accusations. This revelation transformed the entire landscape of Miss Marple's understanding, for it suggested that Mr. Denby had possessed a motive beyond simple fear of exposure. He had sought to discredit Thomas in his aunt's eyes and thereby isolate him from his position of trust and influence. However, the question remained as to whether Mr. Denby had merely sought to undermine Thomas's standing with his aunt, or whether he had undertaken far more direct action to eliminate the threat that Thomas's threatened exposure represented. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Hartwell for her candor and excused herself from further conversation, claiming that she had forgotten an appointment with her doctor. As she walked toward her cottage, her mind was engaged in the complex process of constructing a narrative that encompassed not merely the murder itself, but the network of relationships, revelations, and calculated actions that had led inexorably to Thomas's death. The preceding evening, she had received a telephone call from Inspector Blackwood indicating that his investigation had uncovered evidence suggesting that Mr. Denby had attempted to manipulate circumstances to place suspicion upon Thomas while simultaneously securing his own position through the elimination of the one individual who possessed both knowledge of his crimes and the determination to expose them. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by certain aspects of this narrative, for while it provided adequate explanation for Mr. Denby's motivation, it failed to account for the meticulous planning and execution that the murder had required. Nor did it fully explain certain peculiarities in the physical evidence that continued to trouble her analytical faculties. As evening descended upon Thornfield, Miss Marple sat in her customary chair, her knitting abandoned beside her, her attention focused entirely upon the intricate puzzle that remained stubbornly resistant to complete resolution. The breakthrough in Miss Marple's understanding came not through any revelation disclosed by the official investigation, but rather through a seemingly insignificant observation regarding the schoolmaster, Mr. Edmund Briggs, whose behavior throughout the affair had remained curiously consistent despite the substantial developments that had characterized the preceding days. Miss Marple had observed, during their walk in the park, that Mr. Briggs possessed knowledge of Thomas's pattern of financial misconduct extending back over a period of years, suggesting that he had maintained an awareness of the younger man's activities that transcended the bounds of mere professional concern. Furthermore, she had noted that Mr. Briggs had been present in the village during the period when the financial scheme involving Mr. Denby had been developed and executed, occupying a position of proximity to both the banker and various members of the community who possessed knowledge of questionable transactions. It was this confluence of observations that prompted Miss Marple to undertake a visit to the schoolhouse under the pretext of inquiring about the arrangements for the upcoming village children's fundraising pageant, a matter that gave her legitimate reason to seek Mr. Briggs' counsel and, more significantly, to observe his environment and his reactions to her presence with the meticulous attention that she applied to all matters of investigative consequence. Mr. Briggs received her with the cordiality that characterized his usual demeanor, though Miss Marple detected in his bearing a tension that had not been present during their previous encounter. She broached the subject of the pageant with practiced ease, allowing him to discuss the various logistical arrangements and financial considerations that such an undertaking required. As they spoke, Miss Marple moved casually about his study, ostensibly admiring his collection of books and artifacts, while in reality conducting a systematic examination of his personal circumstances. It was upon a shelf containing various papers and correspondence that her attention focused with sudden intensity, for there lay among the documents a letter addressed to Mr. Briggs bearing the seal of a London solicitor and dated approximately 3 weeks previously. Miss Marple, employing the dexterous sleight of hand that decades of knitting had developed, managed to observe the general content of the correspondence without appearing to do so deliberately. The letter, from what she could discern, concerned a matter of substantial financial significance and appeared to reference an inheritance of considerable magnitude that had recently become available to Mr. Briggs through the death of a distant relative. This revelation, innocent in itself, took on profoundly suggestive dimensions when combined with certain other observations that Miss Marple had made regarding Mr. Briggs's recent improvements to his accommodations and his apparent acquisition of various items that suggested enhanced financial circumstances. She ventured, therefore, to comment upon what appeared to be recent improvements to his lodgings, noting with apparent innocent pleasure that he seemed to have acquired certain comforts that suggested improvement in his financial situation. Mr. Briggs's response was careful and measured, his explanation regarding the inheritance delivered with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at his improved circumstances. However, Miss Marple observed in the schoolmaster's expression a peculiar quality that suggested his satisfaction at his financial improvement contained within it an element of anxiety or tension that seemed inconsistent with the uncomplicated pleasure that one would anticipate from an unexpected inheritance. She pressed gently, inquiring whether the inheritance had perhaps arrived at a particularly opportune moment, just as he was considering certain expenditures or undertakings that he might previously have believed beyond his financial means. Mr. Briggs' countenance underwent a subtle shift, and Miss Marple recognized in this change the manifestation of discomfort that suggested her inquiry had touched upon matters that he had preferred to leave unexamined. He admitted, with visible reluctance, that the inheritance had indeed arrived at a moment of considerable financial strain, for he had undertaken certain investments during the preceding year that had not proven as profitable as he had anticipated. It was at this juncture in their conversation that Miss Marple made a casual observation regarding Mr. Denby's financial schemes, mentioning that she had gathered from various conversations around the village that the banker had apparently involved numerous individuals in investments of questionable legitimacy. She watched with the practiced stillness of someone who had developed the art of observation into a precision instrument as Mr. Briggs' expression underwent a rapid succession of changes. Alarm, calculation, and finally a resignation that suggested the schoolmaster had recognized that his involvement in these schemes had been revealed to someone possessed of sufficient intelligence and discretion to understand its implications. Mr. Briggs confessed, with evident distress, that he had indeed been persuaded by Mr. Denby to invest a substantial portion of his modest savings in what had been represented as a promising business venture. The investment had instead evaporated, and he had been facing not merely the loss of his savings, but potential financial ruin that would have forced him into circumstances of considerable hardship and humiliation within the village community. The inheritance had therefore arrived precisely when he had been contemplating actions of a more desperate character to escape from the consequences of his financial entanglement with the banker. Miss Marple listened to these revelations with her customary attentiveness, her mind already beginning to construct the architecture of a narrative considerably more complex than the official investigation had thus far contemplated. The question that now occupied her analytical faculties was not whether Mr. Briggs possessed knowledge of financial crimes, or even whether he harbored resentment toward those responsible for his circumstances, but rather whether his acquisition of the inheritance had occurred with sufficient proximity to Thomas Hartwell's death to suggest a connection between these two seemingly independent events. The evening following her visit to Mr. Briggs' schoolhouse found Miss Marple in conversation with Inspector Blackwood at the police station, where she had requested a private interview ostensibly to provide additional observations regarding the crime scene, but in reality to share the conclusions that her investigation had produced. Inspector Blackwood received her with a mixture of professional courtesy and evident skepticism, his manner suggesting that he had begun to question whether an elderly woman's intuitions regarding village psychology could reasonably be expected to illuminate matters that the official investigation had addressed through rigorous forensic examination and systematic interrogation. However, as Miss Marple began to articulate her observations regarding the curious timing of Mr. Briggs's inheritance and the schoolmaster's recent financial difficulties, the inspector's expression underwent a subtle transformation that indicated his recognition of the potential significance of these details. Miss Marple explained with meticulous precision that the inheritance which Mr. Briggs had claimed to have received from a distant relative bore certain peculiarities that warranted closer examination. The solicitor's letter, she noted, had referenced the inheritance as having been secured through the resolution of a complex legal matter involving contested property rights and disputed wills. Furthermore, she observed that the timing of this inheritance, arriving mere weeks before Thomas Hartwell's death, suggested either remarkable coincidence or a connection between these events that deserved investigation more thorough than a mere acceptance of Mr. Briggs' explanation would permit. Inspector Blackwood acknowledged these observations with what appeared to be genuine interest, though he expressed concern that her suggestions lacked the concrete evidence required to justify further interrogation of the schoolmaster regarding matters that, on their surface, appeared to be purely financial in nature. Miss Marple responded to this objection with the calm certainty of someone who possessed knowledge that transcended the bounds of official evidence, explaining that she had observed certain inconsistencies in Mr. Briggs's account of his recent activities that suggested knowledge of events that he had not voluntarily disclosed. Specifically, she noted that during her conversation with him, Mr. Briggs had made a casual reference to the orchard path and the gazebo that stood upon it, demonstrating familiarity with a location that he had subsequently attempted to characterize as being outside his customary walking routes. Furthermore, she had observed that his hands bore calluses and minor abrasions consistent with recent engagement in carpentry or construction activities, marks that seemed inconsistent with his profession as a schoolmaster, and that suggested involvement in the kind of physical labor that would be required to deliberately weaken the structural integrity of the gazebo's supporting beams. Inspector Blackwood appeared to undergo a moment of internal recalibration, his expression suggesting that he had begun to recognize the potential validity of Miss Marple's analysis. He revealed in turn that his own investigation had uncovered evidence suggesting that Mr. Briggs had made several visits to the Brennan house during the weeks preceding Thomas's death. Visits that had been witnessed by neighbors but which the schoolmaster had not mentioned during his interviews with the police. What emerged through the careful synthesis of Miss Marple's observations and the additional evidence that Inspector Blackwood had accumulated was a narrative of considerably greater complexity than the simple explanation of murder motivated by fear of financial exposure. Mr. Briggs, it appeared, had been utilized by Mr. Denby as an intermediary in certain financial transactions, rendering him not merely a victim of the banker's schemes, but also a complicit participant in activities of questionable legality. When Thomas Hartwell had begun to investigate the nature of these transactions with the intention of exposing them, he had inadvertently placed himself in direct opposition not merely to Mr. Denby, but also to Mr. Briggs, whose financial future depended upon the continuation of arrangements that Thomas threatened to disrupt. Furthermore, Mr. Briggs had apparently been aware of Mr. Denby's intention to manipulate circumstances to discredit Thomas in his aunt's eyes, and the schoolmaster had recognized in this situation an opportunity to eliminate a threat to his own well-being while simultaneously ensuring that suspicion would be directed toward the banker rather than toward himself. The inheritance that Mr. Briggs had received appeared, upon closer examination, to have been facilitated by Mr. Denby through manipulated legal proceedings and the intervention of sympathetic solicitors, effectively serving as compensation for Mr. Briggs's willingness to undertake the delicate and dangerous work of engineering Thomas's death in a manner that would appear accidental rather than deliberately orchestrated. Inspector Blackwood authorized the return to the Brennan house for a more thorough examination of the property, and it was there that the crucial evidence was discovered. Tools bearing Mr. Briggs' fingerprints stored within the locked cabinet whose key had been found beside Thomas's body. The key itself, upon further investigation, proved to have been stolen from Mr. Briggs's possession by Thomas during one of their chance encounters, a theft that had prompted the schoolmaster to take more direct action to prevent exposure of the scheme. The meticulous preparation of the gazebo's collapse, the careful timing that had ensured Thomas would be present at precisely the moment when the weakened structure would fail, the placement of the key beside the body to create confusion regarding motive and identity, all of these elements reflected a mind engaged in careful calculation and psychological manipulation of the sort that transcended mere criminality, and suggested instead a personality capable of profound deception and calculated ruthlessness. As Inspector Blackwood prepared to authorize the arrest of Mr. Edmund Briggs on charges of murder and conspiracy, he turned to Miss Marple with an expression that combined genuine respect with a certain unease at the recognition that an elderly woman's understanding of human nature had proven more reliable than the systematic methodology of professional law enforcement. Miss Marple, receiving this silent acknowledgment, merely smiled with the gentle composure that had characterized her response to the affairs of Thornfield Village for decades, recognizing that the solution to human crime invariably rested upon understanding the complicated landscape of human motivation that transcended reason and descended into the darker territories of the human heart. The arrest of Mr. Edmund Briggs occurred with the kind of quiet discretion that small villages seemed invariably to demand. The constables arriving at the schoolhouse in the early morning hours, when fewer witnesses would observe the schoolmaster's departure from the community that had, until the moment of his apprehension, regarded him as a respected and respectable member of its social fabric. Miss Marple had learned of the arrest through the inevitable village telegraph, the network of observation and communication that constituted the true nervous system of Thornfield's collective consciousness. By mid-morning, the entire village seemed possessed of knowledge regarding the charges against Mr. Briggs, though the official details remained deliberately obscure, permitting speculation to flourish with the vigor that characterized village gossip in the aftermath of significant scandal. Miss Marple received visits from various concerned citizens throughout the day, each seeking confirmation of rumors and attempting to extract from her the kind of intimate knowledge that her presence at the various stages of the investigation had apparently granted her. She responded to these inquiries with her customary combination of genuine sympathy and careful discretion, neither confirming nor denying the various theories that circulated through the village, but instead offering observations regarding human nature that seemed to satisfy her visitors' need to comprehend how an apparently respectable man could undertake such a dark act. It was not until 3 days following Mr. Briggs's arrest that Inspector Blackwood requested Miss Marple's presence at the police station for what he characterized as a final debriefing regarding the case. She arrived to find the inspector seated in his temporary office with the demeanor of a man who had successfully resolved a matter of considerable professional consequence, yet whose resolution had brought him limited satisfaction. He explained that Mr. Briggs had, following his initial denial of involvement, eventually confessed to the murder with a candor that suggested both resignation and a certain perverse satisfaction at finally disclosing the truth regarding his actions. The schoolmaster had admitted to deliberately weakening the gazebo's structural supports over a period of several weeks, timing his work to coincide with periods when the orchard path would be unoccupied and his activities would escape observation. He had arranged, through subtle manipulation of circumstances, to ensure that Thomas would be present at the gazebo during the afternoon of the garden party, utilizing Frances Denby as an unwitting accomplice by informing her that Thomas intended to meet him at that location to discuss the financial matters that had been troubling them both. The actual murder had been accomplished with a callousness that suggested psychological disturbance of considerable magnitude, Mr. Briggs having positioned himself to observe the gazebo's collapse from a distance, ensuring that his intended victim would indeed perish when the weakened structure failed beneath his weight. What had motivated Mr. Briggs to undertake such an elaborate and dangerous scheme, Inspector Blackwood continued, extended far beyond the simple fear of financial exposure that might have driven Mr. Denby to similar desperation. The schoolmaster harbored toward Thomas Hartwell a resentment that had festered for years, originating in their schoolboy days when Thomas had publicly humiliated Mr. Briggs in front of their classmates through cruel mockery regarding his poverty and lack of social standing. This childhood wound had never healed, instead developing into a slow burning fury that had been reignited when Thomas had begun to investigate the financial schemes involving Mr. Denby and Mr. Briggs himself. The opportunity to eliminate his childhood tormentor while simultaneously removing a threat to his own financial security had proven irresistible to Mr. Briggs's damaged psychology, and he had undertaken the murder with a meticulous deliberation that suggested the careful planning of someone who had, in some sense, been anticipating the possibility of such action for decades. Miss Marple listened to these revelations with her customary attentiveness, though her expression suggested that she had already recognized these fundamental truths through her own process of observation and analysis. She thanked Inspector Blackwood for his thoroughness in resolving the matter and rose to depart, only to be detained by the inspector's final comment regarding his recognition of the invaluable contribution that her investigation had made to the resolution of the case. Over the ensuing weeks, Thornfield gradually returned to something approximating its former rhythms, though the village would forever bear the subtle marks of the tragedy that had disrupted its peaceful existence. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, freed from the burden of her nephew's financial misconduct and apparently unmoved by his death, continued to manage her estate with the same meticulous attention that had characterized her previous stewardship. Mr. Denby faced prosecution for his financial crimes and was eventually imprisoned, his daughter Frances ultimately relocating to London to escape the social consequences of her family's scandal. The Brennan house, its secrets exposed and its sinister utility concluded, returned to its state of abandoned neglect, the locked cabinet removed and its contents catalogued as evidence in the official record. Miss Marple, in the aftermath of the investigation, found herself returning to her customary patterns of village observation, her knitting needles resuming their rhythmic work with the same steadfast persistence that had characterized decades of her quiet life. Yet something had shifted in her understanding of Thornfield, for she had been reminded anew that beneath the surface of any community, however peaceful its appearance and however respectable its citizens, there existed always the potential for darkness, resentment, and violence, waiting only for the appropriate confluence of circumstances to manifest itself in the most terrible and irreversible of actions. As she sat in her comfortable chair, watching the autumn light filter through her cottage windows, Miss Marple reflected that human nature remained eternally the same, whether expressed in the grand dramas of history or in the quiet tragedies of small villages, and that understanding this fundamental truth represented perhaps the most important education that the years could provide to those sufficiently attentive to observe it.